Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this program, Reap What You Sow, Refugee Caravans at the U.S.-Mexican Border with Dr. Tom O'Keefe. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team at Deschutes Public Library. This month, we're celebrating our community-wide reading program, A Novel Idea, Read Together. Tonight's program is part of our exploration of this year's book, The Other Americans by Leila Leilani, a book that highlights the immigrant experience. For 18 years, we have read and discussed an amazing variety of books as a community, and we couldn't do it without the support of our sponsors. Thank you. For more information about A Novel Idea, the largest community reading program in Oregon, and other events and programs we have this month, please visit our website, deschuteslibrary.org/novel idea. A special thank you to the Latino Outreach Visioning Steering Group at Trinity Episcopal Church for their participation in making this program possible. Thomas Andrew O'Keefe, a dual national of the United States and Chile, is the president of the legal and economic consulting firm Mercosur Consulting. He did his undergraduate work at Columbia University and received his JD from the Villanova University School of Law. He has taught courses on colonial Latin America, Western Hemispheric economic integration, and the political economy of the Southern Cone countries in South America, energy and climate cooperation in the Americas, and U.S. Latin America diplomatic history at American University, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, and Stanford University. Please welcome Tom O'Keefe.
Thank you very much. And I actually happen to be in Bend, Oregon now as we speak. Even though unfortunately we couldn't do this live because of the pandemic, but I am here, and it's a very beautiful part of the country. It's actually the first time I've ever actually been in Bend, Oregon. What I want to talk about today is more the historical background to a lot of what we see happening at the border, particularly the U.S.-Mexico border. Although we've kind of farmed out our attempts to keep immigrants from the three northern countries of Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to Mexico now for a number of years. So much of what is going on is not just at the U.S.-Mexico border, it's also at the border, particularly between Guatemala and Mexico. And so what I want to give tonight is just to put things in an historical context of why the United States, beyond a legal obligation that may arise from international law and also from U.S. Political asylum and refugee law, why the United States also has a moral responsibility to address this issue. Because a lot of the reason why these three countries are the way they are today and have caused this exodus of refugees from these three northern countries in Central America has a lot to do with what we have been doing in that part of the world, starting for at least 100 years. But what I'm going to focus and emphasize on is what has happened in Guatemala since the United States overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, since the Civil War erupted in El Salvador in 1979, and a lot of the things that we have done in Honduras, particularly beginning in the 1980s. When we used Honduras basically as a base to train a group of terrorists who were attempting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua at the time. Now, if we have some time, we can talk a little bit about, why is it that this exodus is really confined to these three northern countries in Central America and doesn't include the other countries of Central America. In particular, Nicaragua, even though it's going through a lot of political and economic turmoil as we speak, sadly enough, by the leader of a revolutionary movement who came to power in the 80s, promising all sorts of wonderful things for Nicaraguans. But he, unfortunately, and his wife seem to be much more interested in filling their pockets and becoming as much of kleptocrats as the Somozos were, the dynasty, political dynasty that he helped overthrow in the 70s and 80s. And the other Central American country, of course, that we don't hear any refugees from is Costa Rica, and further to the south, Panama. So if we have time, we can talk a little bit why that is, all right? But for this evening, I'm going to focus on these three northern countries in Central America. Briefly, I just want to highlight, I want to share the screen. There are basically three ways that the Central Americans from these three countries can actually acquire legal residency in the U.S. One of them is the way, or at least three major ways. One of them is actually the way many immigrants have come to the United States, particularly after our immigration law was changed in 1965, which is family reunification. So it is possible, for example, if there is somebody from Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador who has a relative, usually it's a parent or a child or a sister or a brother who is already in the United States, who is a citizen of the United States. They can sponsor their relative from Central America to legally come to the U.S. as a resident, and then after a number of years, they themselves, if they want, can apply for U.S. citizenship as well too. For many Central Americans, this is very difficult, even though there's large, very large Central American communities scattered throughout the United States. Some of you may know that the largest El Salvadoran city in the world after San Salvador, the capital, is Los Angeles. And there are very large Salvadoran communities who live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., particularly in Fairfax County, Arlington County in Virginia, and Montgomery County in Maryland. And the same holds true for people from Honduras and people from Guatemala as well also. Now, the problem, though, is that we have a situation where even though you may be able to show that you can sponsor this close relative, that they're not going to be a burden to the U.S. economy, there's a huge time gap or a backlog in processing these types of applications. And in the case of the three northern Central American countries, we're talking about years, maybe even decades. All right, so it's not a very viable option. The other possibility, and it's how many Central Americans find themselves from these three countries in the U.S., particularly El Salvador and Honduras, is temporary protected status. So if there's some sort of a civil war, or if there's some sort of a natural catastrophe, the U.S. in the past has been willing to temporarily grant residency to people fleeing those situations in the U.S. And by being granted that temporary status to reside in the U.S., you also get the right to work here, all right? There has been TPS, temporary protected status, for people from El Salvador going all the way back to the 1980s. And it came up again, it was renewed again in 2001 in response to a very bad earthquake they had in El Salvador. So for El Salvadorans, there are many people from El Salvador in the U.S. who are still here under this TPS status, temporary protected status. Guatemala, despite all the turmoil, the Civil War that lasted for 36 years, natural catastrophes, has never been given TPS status. And the other country that has had it since 1998 is Honduras because of Hurricane Mitch. Okay, now you can say, well, how is it, that these events happened a long, long time ago and they're over? Why is it that these people are still here under this temporary protected status? It's basically because Congress and the administrations and the White House have, for whatever the reason, decided to extend it. All right. Finally, Donald Trump, though, decided this was enough. All right. And a couple of years ago, he decided to eliminate temporary protected status for people from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, and from a number of other countries around the world that also had it. And there was a case that was filed in the Northern District of California, and that basically said, the way the Trump administration had gone about getting rid of TPS was illegal. And so therefore, while this issue is resolved, people from El Salvador, people from Nicaragua as well too, but by the way, they also have TPS status. The people from Honduras can remain in the United States, and their work authorizations actually have been extended until October of this year. Okay. Now the supposition is that on appeal, it may be that decision of a district court judge in California may be reversed, and so these people would lose their TPS. Okay. So anyway, those are two options, and the third option is the basic grounds for asylum or refugee status. Which is you can apply for political asylum, right? This is a very narrow exception, all right? And if you look at what the grounds are, you have to be either a victim of past persecution or have a well-founded fear of current or future persecution. In the case of past persecution, it has to be based on one of 5 grounds: either your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or your membership in a particular social group. All right. The vast majority of Central Americans who are coming to the United States do not qualify for political asylum, even though they all ask for it now. Okay. So it isn't a surprise that most Central Americans, more than 80%, 85%, their petitions are not granted. They're eventually rejected. It used to be when they showed up at the border and asked for political asylum, they would be temporarily released, usually in the care of a family member who was already in the U.S. And then they would have to wait until their petition was adjudicated. The Trump administration changed all that. It basically either told people they would have to wait in a jail cell, or the other option was, stay in Mexico, apply from there, and wait, the year or 2 years that it takes to have your case adjudicated. And that is a problem. Because some of you may know that these border cities in Mexico on the U.S. border are among the most unsafe urban centers, not just in Latin America, but in the world. There's just very high levels of kidnappings, of homicides. These people are very liable to being kidnapped, for example, by cartels, et cetera, et cetera. So that wasn't a very good thing to be basically telling people you can apply for asylum, but you have to wait in a horribly dangerous situation. Okay. All right. Anyway, let me. I've been on this share screen for a while, but again, these legal ways to get residency in the United States are very limited. And that's the reason why it's important for us. particularly given that this is one of the organizations that's sponsoring this talk is Trinity Episcopal. There's a very strong moral argument for why these people should be allowed, temporarily at least, residency here in the U.S. And it has to do, as I said, with this historical role that the U.S. Has had in this part of the world. It's a role many times that has thwarted the political development of these countries. And by thwarting that political development, it's also had horrible economic ramifications as well, too. Let me just give you one example, Guatemala. In 1954, we had a democratically elected president of the country. He was the second one in Guatemala's history. All right. There had been a revolution at the very end of the Second World War in 1944 to overthrow this very bloodthirsty dictator who had been in power for years and years, supported by, among others, the banana industry, the U.S. banana industry. But in any case, Uico was his name. He was finally overthrown in 44. So we had a school teacher who became the president, very reform-minded, used Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal as his model for how he wanted to modernize Guatemala, okay? And he was succeeded by another democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. Now, Jacobo Arbenz was very much interested, among other things, in agrarian reform. One of the problems in Guatemala in particular, it has one of the largest indigenous populations in Latin America. A majority, or at least just under a majority of the population of Guatemala are indigenous peoples, Native Americans. But they are people who, from the time the Spanish conquered Central America, have been completely marginalized and excluded from really any type of opportunities, including the ability to own land. I mean, their land was taken from them, and it was given to these elite families associated with the first conquerors of not just Guatemala, but this happened throughout Latin America as well, too. And so what Arbenz wanted to do was to have a agrarian reform in which some of this land would be confiscated from these wealthy families and given to these impoverished indigenous people. Now, one of the largest landowners in Guatemala at the time was United Fruit. And the banana industry needs a lot of land. It needs a lot of fallow land as well, too, because when you grow bananas, you use up the nutrients in the ground very quickly. And so what happened was that United Fruit was actually one of the largest landowners in the country as well. So when this agrarian reform was implemented, a lot of the land of United Fruit was confiscated. And now this created a problem, okay? But it wasn't the only reason why this raised the antennae of people in Washington, D.C., in particular the Eisenhower administration. It was also because there were accusations that a lot of the advisors of Jacobo Arbenz were communists. And of course, this is the time when the United States begins, we begin this Cold War that went on through the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and right up almost until the end of the 80s. And so the U.S. was also concerned that Jacobo Arbenz, even if he himself wasn't a communist, but he was opening up his government to communist influence, and that might eventually lead to, for example, the Soviet Union having a base or a country in the Americas that then he could then utilize to go against the interests of the U.S. So what Eisenhower did was he authorized the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to organize a coup that was in the end successful. It overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Now, Guatemala. And so this was in 1954. Within 6 years after this initial coup happened, young reform-minded members of the armed forces of Guatemala grew disgusted, not just at the ruthless um, suppression of human rights in their country, but the large-scale corruption as well of higher members of the armed forces. And so they fled into the countryside, particularly the jungle regions of Guatemala, and that's the origins of this guerrilla movement that attempted to overthrow these military governments in Guatemala. Things got to a really bad point by the late 1970s. We had a government in Guatemala, a military government headed by a fellow by the name of General Romero Lucas and Garcia, who began this scorched earth policy against the guerrillas and their perceived supporters. And among those perceived supporters were indigenous people. So beginning in the late 1970s, we actually have a genocide that's commenced among members of the Maya, various different Maya indigenous groups in Guatemala. There's an exodus of Guatemalans from the country at that time, particularly indigenous people. Most of them fled to southern Mexico. Some, though, did make it up to the U.S. And they actually form the first significant communities of Guatemalans who here in the U.S. Okay, it's this group that fled this genocide that started in the 70s and continued. This General Romeo Lucas Garcia was eventually replaced by another general. His name was Efrian Rios Montt, who continued the same policy as his predecessors as well too. The end of this civil war in Guatemala did not happen until the mid-1980s. So it was quite a long period of time. As I said, it was almost 36 years. U.S. heavily involved. The only exception really was the Carter administration that imposed an arms embargo, but all the other military governments were all supported by various different administrations, with both Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so that's the story with Guatemala. So quickly shifting over to another country, El Salvador. There was a civil war that finally exploded, or there was a lot of social discontent, conflictive relationships between employers, employees, etc. in El Salvador, but it finally exploded in a civil war in 1979. The Carter administration's initial response really was more to try to bring the parties to the negotiation table to try to resolve this peacefully. But he was very quickly replaced by Ronald Reagan. And the Reagan administration, once again, viewed this conflict, this internal conflict and civil war in El Salvador, which really responded to, issues that had to do with this huge disparity in wealth that existed in the country. I mean, most of El Salvador's wealth was actually in the hand of 14 families. And the vast majority of Salvadorans were poor and impoverished. And so, that's really what caused this social explosion. But the Reagan administration didn't view it that way. I mean, what they viewed it was again, through the prism of the Cold War. It is true that these early guerrilla movements that formed, that were on the other side of the Civil War, trying to overthrow either the military government and then eventually a civilian government that was propped up by the military. It is true these groups were on the left of the political spectrum, supported by, among others, Cuba. Okay, not everyone though. There were a lot of people who joined the guerrillas who actually came from the center of the political spectrum in El Salvador, but felt there really were no other options at that point. They had tried to resolve things peacefully, and in the end, there was these death squads that were formed, paramilitary groups on the right, supported by these 14 families, and they started going after these more moderate, centrist political opponents who wanted change as well. Now, this also created a huge outflow of Salvadoran refugees who fled to the U.S. And so what ended up happening was that that's one of the reasons why the U.S. government decided to give temporary protected status to these very large communities of Salvadorans who were found themselves fleeing the war in their home country and couldn't go back. Okay. Now, some of these people Salvadorans who found themselves in the U.S. Were children, very young children. And they grew up in marginalized communities, South Central LA, East LA. And as they grew up and they really didn't have education opportunities and what have you, they drifted into gangs. These are U.S. gangs. So these were gangs that were present in the U.S. All right, 18th Street Gang, for example, which gets its name from a location in South Central LA. The Salvatrucha Mara Salvatrucha was also MS-13. All right, but this is another group that has its origins in the slums of LA. So by this point, it's the 1990s. Bill Clinton is the president of the United States. And what he decides to do is these kids who are members of gangs, if they've committed a crime, they're convicted. If they're convicted, they serve their time in a U.S. jail. But once they're released, his solution was to put these kids on an airplane and send them back to El Salvador, a country that many had not been in since they were 2 or 3 years old. The vast majority didn't speak Spanish or didn't speak Spanish very well. And they're showing up in a country that has just ended a civil war, in which there are no job opportunities for people who have the qualifications. And you're interjecting these kids who don't usually have much of an education at all, and who have a criminal record. So who's going to hire them? And particularly in an environment, in an economy where the unemployment rate is already 20, 25, 30%. So it's no wonder that eventually they reconstituted themselves in Salvadoran society as a gang, a criminal gang. And now that was exacerbated by the fact that the country had just ended a civil war. So you have all these arms floating around as well, because of the end of the war. And so it was, the perfect, marriage that created a complete disaster in El Salvador. And it's one of the reasons why El Salvador, even today, has one of the highest homicide rates in the world. So anyway, that's a very quick, brief overview of what happened in El Salvador. And finally, the other country is Honduras. Honduras, the U.S. role is not as overt, but the U.S. actually was present. It had a military base in near the capital, Tegucigalpa, in the 1980s. It was used to train the Contras, which was, as I said, this terrorist group that the United States trained, funded, with the objective of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua. A government, by the way, which we had diplomatic relations with, which under our own, the U.S. Neutrality Act, we had no business trying to overthrow. Okay? So in any event, though, we did. That situation in Honduras made it very difficult to consolidate a legitimately representative government that represented the vast majority of the interests of people in the country. I mean, historically in Honduras, the two main political parties have represented maybe the 10% at the top of the population. And the rest of the 90% really are completely marginalized politically. And so what happened in the 80s in Honduras did not facilitate trying to change that. And when Hondurans agitated against this to try to open up their political system, their representative democracy, what you oftentimes found was that they were thwarted, they were persecuted, and many times with the connivance of the U.S. The U.S. ambassador at the time, Negroponte, who eventually became U.S. ambassador to the UN under George W. Bush, was very much aware of what was going on, this persecution. And he basically essentially looked the other way because the U.S. was more interested in utilizing Honduras as a base to train and a base from which the Contras could then carry out their attacks on Nicaragua. Okay. We had another very sorry incident in Honduras in 2009. There was one of the traditional parties, their candidate for the presidency had won, and he had a change of, or pang of conscience perhaps, but what he decided to do was to attempt to reform his country, open up more opportunities for a greater number of people in the country, and he was overthrown. He was overthrown by the military. They basically put him on an airplane and they sent him to Costa Rica. The U.S. initially, like the rest of the Western Hemisphere, all the other countries in the Americas, at the Organization of American States, declared this to be a coup. And because of this, the democratic charter that we have in the OAS now since 2001, if there is an interruption in representative democracy in a country, a member of the OAS, that country is suspended. Okay, and everyone else in the hemisphere was in agreement. The U.S. was in agreement as well too. But what unfortunately happened was, for reasons of expediency, the United States did not continue to insist that Mel Zelaya was his name, be restored to power. And so therefore what the expedient route that the U.S. took was basically to run the clock out on his term, which ended at the end of that year. And then there was another election already scheduled. And so the person who won that election took power, and the U.S. recognized him as the legitimate president of the country. But unfortunately, this was something that was not accepted by everyone in Honduras. And Honduras ever since really has been involved in a lot of, there's been a lot of political instability, a lot of infighting. The current president of Honduras, interestingly enough, is his brother has been indicted in New York for drug trafficking. There are lots of other people associated with that case who have implicated the current president of Honduras as well. But the interesting thing here about it, he was reelected, all right? And this is important, because the reason why the military overthrew Mel Zelaya in 2009 was they claimed that the Honduran constitution did not permit re-election. And what Mel Zelaya had proposed was a plebiscite in which he was going to ask the people of Honduras, did they want the constitution to be changed to allow for re-election, all right? And that, just the very act of asking the people of Honduras, if they wanted to change their constitution, according to the military, that was sufficient grounds to remove him from office. But interestingly enough, fast forward about 10 years, 15 years, the current president of Honduras did exactly that. He didn't even ask for a plebiscite. What he did was he went to his friends, some of whom he himself had appointed to the Supreme Court of Honduras, to get permission, authorization for him to run again. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, in 2009, when this happened, you had a whole array of Republicans in the US Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, who all of a sudden became instant experts in Honduran constitutional law. In fact, one of them, Jim DeMint, the senator at the time from South Carolina, got on an airplane and went to Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, to defend what the military had done. When the current president of Honduras, who, as I said, has been implicated in drug trafficking, when he did the same thing, no one in Congress, least of all the Republicans, said anything. But again, this is just, it just underscores that, the U.S. really has never been interested in democracy, has never been interested in economic development in Honduras. And so the end result is that we have a country that's a living hell for most of its citizens. And so that's, yet again, another situation where, you have lots of people trying to flee. All right, I'm sure I have inundated you with, lots of little factoids, a lot of history. And so at this point, I would just like to conclude my remarks. And, if there are questions that people have, by all means, feel free to ask them. I'll do my best to try to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So I'm hearing a lot of background noise. It sounds like you guys are having a gathering over there.
Yes.
Not exactly.
Well,
Yes.
I'm wondering if we can take a few minutes of quiet time so we can get some questions answered. Okay, so first question from Brad. Why hasn't the U.S. ever, that I'm aware of, admitted people from Mexico or Central America with refugee status?
Well, basically because, in theory at least, Mexico, since the revolution of 1910, has been a representative democracy. And so therefore, there is, at least from a political perspective, there's been no reason ever to grant temporary protected status or to recognize Mexicans fleeing Mexico for political persecution. Now, interestingly enough, though, there have been instances where certain people actually from Mexico have gotten political asylum in the U.S., but it has to do, if you remember those categories, one of them is membership in a social group. And so there was a time when gay people, for example, could claim that they suffered persecution in Mexico, and therefore that was, because of their inclusion in a social group, that it would, even if the government itself wasn't directly persecuting them, but elements of the Mexican government were, that would be sufficient. Okay. But this issue opens up something that's very interesting as well too. There are lots of immigration judges who will interpret those very limited categories in a more expansive way to allow people to gain political asylum in the U.S. That, if you look at the black letter law, you kind of leave your head scratching. Well, how did this happen? And that's because there is a certain level of discretion given to immigration law judges in the U.S. To make that determination if a particular individual in the particular circumstances qualifies. The problem with that, though, is that it's very arbitrary. If you are an immigrant or a person who is suffering political asylum or a refugee, and you happen to file your petition, for example, in a very liberal part of the country, like San Francisco, you have a much better chance of appearing before, or your case appearing before, a more liberal judge who will make that very expansive interpretation. But again, it's very arbitrary, and we need something that is more uniform, that gives more confidence to people, that their case will be genuinely heard and decided by a common criteria, and not something that really depends on the opinion of the particular judge that you happen to appear before.
Yeah, thank you. So second question is from Joanne. As a white Latino, how do you reconcile telling the stories of brown Latinos impacted by imperialism from your place of privilege as a white man? When and how do you pass the mic so that Black and brown Latinos receive the financial benefit of telling their histories and stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is that, if we're going to divide ourselves into camps, and who has more legitimacy to tell the story or not, we're not going to get anywhere on this planet. All right, we're all human beings. We're all, we all have very varied histories and backgrounds, and we all are entitled to contribute to trying to make this world a better place. And so therefore, this idea that only certain people are entitled to speak or to express an opinion and everyone else has to keep their mouth shut, I find really very insulting. And it certainly doesn't, it's not in keeping with, what should be ideally how we govern ourselves here in the United States, a democracy where everyone has a right to speak and to express their opinions. That kind of mentality is the type of mentality that leads to totalitarianism, fascism, that only certain people have the right to speak and everyone else has to basically keep their mouth shut. I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Stephen Ruth would like to know why Nicaragua, despite its history and instability, is not one of the source countries for this wave of immigrants.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and it has a lot to do with the fact that Nicaragua, under the 80s, under the Sandinista revolution, it set up actually a very effective police force. And it's a police force actually that has not been as susceptible to corruption as you find, for example, in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras as well. Now, there's a political reason why that is, because the Sandinista government was actually using its police force as a way to serve as the eyes and ears of the regime to spy on people. So that isn't a positive thing. But the end result was, though, that you ended up with a very, a much better trained police force, very well paid in comparison to, what the police are paid in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras as well. And so it makes them less susceptible to corruption. And so that helps to explain, why, we don't have the same levels of persecution, for example, that we find, for example, in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, let me just say that the situation in Nicaragua for the last 2 or 3 years has been pretty bad politically. There is a lot of repression. What has happened is that a lot of young Nicaraguans in particular who oppose the Ortega regime have fled, but they haven't fled north. They generally flee south. They generally go to either Costa Rica or Panama. And so there is an outflow, but it's not heading north, it's heading south. Okay. You know, the other thing I think that's important to underscore as well too is that the Sandinista regime in the 80s did adopt a lot of programs that helped average Nicaraguans. And this current Ortega government, until it became very politically repressive, also adopted a lot of programs that helped the average Nicaraguan as well too. So at least until 3 years ago, there was no reason for the vast majority of Nicaraguans to leave their country. But as I said, it's changed, but they're just not coming north, they're going south.
Where south?
So we have a question from Mary. She wants to know if you think the Biden administration sees a helpful path forward in order to take the pressure off the border.
Well, I think to the credit of the Biden administration, I think they understand. Joe Biden himself understands quite well what are the real reasons that you have this exodus of people from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. You know, it's fundamentally tied to a lack of economic development, and because there's a lack of economic development, there are no job opportunities. You know, and in addition to that, you have you know, public health sectors that are very bad, very poor quality public education that's offered. So all these things, you know, have made it very difficult for people to support themselves. And so therefore, you know, the Biden administration understands that the only way you're eventually going to be able to resolve this problem is by encouraging economic development in the country. And that economic development has to include the elite of these countries. Because one of the unfortunate things, and it's the main reason for why these countries are so economically developed, because the income inequality in these countries is so skewed, is because of the elite of these countries. One of the things that is most interesting about Central America, particularly Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, is the elite traditionally don't pay their fair share of taxes. These three countries, Guatemala in particularly, has among the lowest intake of revenue from taxes charged on its wealthy citizens. And so if the elite of these countries are not willing to fund a quality education system, a public health sector as well, you know, the United States on itself can't do it either. But the Biden administration, to its credit, is very much aware of this also. And so that's why they keep insisting everything they do has to be based on a partnership. And it has to involve the elites of these countries, the economic elites and the political elites of these countries. Because unless these people are on board, they make a commitment, a financial commitment, the U.S. on its own is not going to be able to do very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have one last question. Let's see, where are we? What policies should the U.S. adopt to address immigration challenges in both the short term and the long term? And this will be our last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. has to first reform its current laws regarding family reunification. It can't say that because there's a large number of applicants coming from a country like El Salvador or Guatemala, they have to wait 10 years, 15 years for their petitions to be processed. Now that has to change. I mean, the U.S., if these people qualify under family reunification to come to the United States as temporary residents, permanent residents. You have to open that up. And maybe it can't be done to everywhere in the world. Maybe it can be done only to these 3 countries in Central America. Given this moral responsibility we have for, in great part, having helped to create the mess that exists in these 3 countries. So maybe that's one concrete thing that could be done to change U.S. immigration law that could benefit people from these 3 countries in particular. But the thing we have to remember also, whether U.S. immigration law has changed or not, if this situation in these 3 countries don't change, these people are going to still keep coming. It's not. This is a delusion to think that simply because you build more walls on the border, or you implement more draconian policies to keep people out, like for example what Donald Trump did, where he's separating families at the border, or he's sending people back to Mexico, to crime-ridden cities, to wait for years for their asylum applications to be processed. I mean, none of that is going to stop the flow, unless you address the root issues of why these people are leaving. We're not going to go anywhere, okay? But at least one option might be, is, as I said, to process these family reunification visas as they come in, and not tell these people they have to wait another 10, 15 years.
Okay.
Yeah, it's such a complicated issue, Tom, and I really appreciate you dissecting the politics and the economics and the history of those areas that are suffering and are making their way to our country to try to find a better life for themselves. So thank you for your scholarship, and thank you for your insight, and please enjoy the rest of your time in Central Oregon.
Thank you very much.
And for those people on the call tonight, you're going to get a survey link so you can provide us some feedback tonight. And do please take a minute to check out our novel idea webpage on DeschutesPublicLibrary.org's website for all the rest of the month's programming that's happening all around Layla Linami's The Other Immigrants, or the Other Americans. There we go. Tom, thank you so much. Nice to meet you. And we'll see you soon.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks, good night.